Welcome to Raytown Chop Shop and part 13 of the KawaBunga build.
In this episode, we'll go over how we put it all back together.
And the final leg of the journey begins. Austin and I propped the painted go-kart up on sawhorses so we could install the front and rear suspensions. The rear axle goes on. We thought far enough ahead not to move the sprocket and brake rotor when we took it off so we wouldn't have to align them again. The rear wheels and tires go on. Next came the front spindles, wheels, and tires. The chrome powder-coated tie rods were next. Mom came up to see how the final assembly was going. We wrapped up this portion of the build by installing the shift pedal and foot pegs.
With the base painted, Dad installed it to the bottom of the seat. Next came the seat adjusters.
With the go-kart still on sawhorses, I placed the seat spacers on the frame. Together, Austin and I positioned the seat over the spacers and dropped it into place. We took turns and tightened up the mounting bolts. Once the seat was secure, we installed the seat belts.
After applying Loctite to all the hardware, we bolted the seat belts to their brackets.
Time to put the go-kart back on the floor and get ready to install the engine. We positioned the exhaust where we thought it was supposed to go, then put the engine mounts on their bases. We threaded the handlebars with all their cables and wires through the roll bars and moved the engine into place. Austin installed the rear shock to its mount. Next, we bolted the engine mounts to the engine and lowered it onto the frame. With the engine in place, we removed the chain and moved the engine hoist out of the way.
Time to cover up the electronics on the back of the frame. We installed the rear cover and I tightened up the 2 mounting screws. We thought we'd put the exhaust where it needed to be before we installed the engine, but we were wrong. We had it too far forward and one of the cross tubes prevented us from getting the exhaust hooked up. So Dad lifted the front of the go-kart while I slid the exhaust into the correct position. With it sort of in the right place, we had to use a jack to raise the back of the go-kart to get the exhaust exactly where we needed it. Finally, we were able to bolt the exhaust pipes to the engine.
Next came the choke cable. Austin had to change positions about 5 times in order to get everything hooked up the way it's supposed to be. With the choke cable installed, it was time to move on to the chain. He took out the master link, wrapped the chain around the sprocket, reinstalled the master link, and snapped on the clip.
Time to install the instrument panel. We used Loctite on all the fasteners and bolted it up. Even though the driver won't be able to see it, at least we'll be able to tell how much gas is in it and whether it's in neutral or not. I wrapped the exposed wiring in a loom.
Austin installed the modified shift lever and tightened everything up.
keep from scratching the paint, installing the shift rod turned into a two-man job. Dad put the rod in the top hole of the shift pedal, while I put the other end in the bottom hole at the shift lever. We wrapped up putting the shift rod on by installing the cotter pins.
Even though we hadn't moved the sprocket, we wanted to double check the chain alignment. We jacked up the back of the go-kart and eyeballed the chain alignment. The chain ran true and straight. Austin checked the chain tension. We slid the engine mounts a little forward to take up the slack in the chain. Once we were happy with the tension, we tightened up the bolts on the mounting plates.
I slid the caliper onto the mounting bracket and bolted it up. We rocked the go-kart back and forth and squeezed the brake lever. We have brakes. I tightened up the bolt on the rear shock mount. I moved around to the other side and installed the accelerator cables to the front brackets. With a little bit of adjustment, I slipped the accelerator cables onto the back bracket. We'll have to make our final adjustments once the handlebars are completely installed.
Austin routed the main wiring harness along the frame and plugged in the connections at the engine. We tested the instrument panel lights and gas gauge. And of course, we had to test the horn.
I moved around to the other side of the go-kart and installed the clutch cable connector. With both cables connected, I installed the rear bracket and tightened it up.
Austin has never been happy with the amount of play in the steering system, so he splurged and bought a steering U-joint. Now, he had to fabricate a couple of shafts to connect the handlebar adapter to the U-joint and the U-joint to the steering shaft. He turned the new adapters on his lathe.
I finally got a chance to try out my new mill. Instead of welding the steering adapters to the U-joint, we decided to use a pin. I set up the U-joint with the adapter installed on my mill. I had to use a few hold downs to keep the U-joint in place. Once everything was securely mounted to the mill, I drilled a hole all the way through. I brushed the filings away, removed the hold downs, and checked the final result.
Now came time to make the pins that will hold the U-joints to the adapters. I found a couple of old head bolts from a small block Chevy I'd rebuilt years ago, and Austin turned them down to the right size.
I got to use my new mill again when I drilled the holes in the pins for the cotter pins. Looks like they're going to work just fine.
With the handlebars and steering shaft lined up the way we want them, Austin made a quick tack weld on the steering shaft.
I welded the handlebar adapter to the U-joint adapter. I slid the handlebar adapter through the bracket and connected it to the U-joint.
I slid the steering shaft through the bracket and Austin installed the U-joint. Now because we're going to use a pin to connect the steering shaft and U-joint, we'll be able to slide the steering shaft out through the bracket if we ever need to work on it in the future.
I placed the handlebars on the adapter and gave them a few turns. The new U-joint and adapters took away a lot of the play we had with the old swivel.
We took the steering system apart again, and I spray painted the adapter and steering shaft white. With the steering shaft and handlebar adapter painted white, it's time to install them for the last time. We applied some grease wherever the shafts go through the brackets. Austin installed the new U-joint on the handlebar adapter, and I slid the steering shaft into place. Once it was hooked up to the new U-joint, Austin installed the pin. He ran cotter pins through both the pins he'd turned earlier. We removed the tie rods and greased the heim joints. With the tie rods reinstalled, we measured the distance between the front of the tires and the rear of the tires to get the alignment as close as possible. It took a few times of adjusting the lengths of the tie rods, but we finally got the front tires aligned so the go-kart will go straight down the road. With the front tires aligned, we tightened up all the heim joints. The steering system is complete.
We're in the final stages now. We secured the clutch cable and brake line to the frame using some zip ties. Once we had everything zip tied, we adjusted the clutch. Time to secure all the cables and wires on the other side. I finished wrapping the wires to the handlebars in wire looms and then secured the entire harness to the frame. I made some minor adjustments on the accelerator cables and zip tied them to the frame.
And here it is. After 14 weeks of cutting, welding, fabricating, and painting, the KawaBunga is done. It all started with a hand-me-down go-kart and a Kawasaki 250. Now most of the credit goes to my son Austin for the concept, the fabrication, and the welding to turn this idea into a fun little go-kart. That's it for part 13. Hope you enjoyed it.
On the next one, we'll take the finished product for a ride and maybe let some of our buddies take it out too.